In the 17th century, New England was a land of challenge and hardship, where life was shaped by faith and the harsh conditions of the environment. The New England colonies, made up mainly of English Puritans, were in full development. These Puritans, known for their religious fervor and their moralistic view of life, sought to create a society that was a reflection of their interpretation of sacred scripture. They firmly believed in predestination and the importance of leading a pious and austere life to earn eternal salvation. In this scenario, New England was a land of dense forests, harsh winters, and unexplored territories. Small Puritan communities were scattered along the coast, with villages made up of simple wooden houses, central churches, and surrounding farmland. Survival depended on hard work, community cooperation, and religious devotion. Any deviation from established norms could lead to severe punishments, social isolation or, in the most extreme case, expulsion from the community. The Puritans' relationship with nature was ambivalent. On the one hand, they saw the earth as a gift from God, an opportunity to create a new Eden where they could live according to their principles. On the other hand, the vast and unexplored forest that surrounded their villages was seen as a place of danger and temptation, possibly inhabited by evil forces. The forests were dense, dark, and mysterious, a frightening contrast to the orderly, controlled life that the Puritans tried to build. For the Puritans, any inexplicable event or deviation from expected behavior was quickly attributed to supernatural influences. Stories of witches, demons, and evil spirits were common, and these beliefs shaped the perception of the world around them. The idea that the forest could be a home to evil forces was a fear deeply rooted in the Puritan psyche. These fears were not just tales to scare children, but a real, tangible part of everyday life. In this historical and cultural context, a Puritan family being rejected by their community was an event of enormous significance. Rejection meant not only the loss of social and economic support but also a mark of spiritual disgrace. The rejected family faced the challenge of surviving alone, away from the protection of the community and shared resources. Deciding to settle on the edge of a remote forest was, in many ways, an act of desperation and faith. Choosing this isolated location spoke to the need to escape shame and judgment, but it also placed the family in an environment where Puritan fears of evil forces could manifest themselves in terrifyingly real ways. The family that stars in our story is made up of the patriarch John, his wife Mary, and their 3 children, Thomas, Elizabeth, and Samuel. They were respected members of the community until a series of unfortunate events culminated in their rejection. John, a devout man, was accused of heresy after publicly questioning some of the local pastors' stricter interpretations of Scripture. His criticism, although well-intentioned, was seen as a threat to the established order and religious cohesion of the community. Mary, always by her husband's side, supported his opinions, which only made the situation worse for both of them. Accusations of heresy were not lighthearted in that time and place. The Puritan community viewed any deviation from orthodoxy as a direct threat to its existence. Community meetings became increasingly tense, and rumors began to circulate. John and Mary were called to trial before the church elders, where their explanations and excuses fell on deaf ears. The sentence was severe: excommunication and banishment from the village. For the community, it was a way to purge the threat that the family posed. For the family, it was a sentence of isolation and uncertainty. Desperate but determined to survive, John and Mary decided to take their children to a place where they could start over, away from critical eyes and unfounded accusations. After days of traveling on foot, carrying only the essentials, they found a clearing on the edge of a dense and apparently unexplored forest. They decided to establish their new home there, building a modest wooden cabin and preparing the land for cultivation. Life there would be difficult, but it was a chance to start over without the shadows of the past. The choice of location, however, was not made without hesitation. The forest, with its vast expanse and deep shadows, was a feared and respected place. Stories of spirits and creatures that inhabited its depths were told in whispers around campfires. But the need for refuge outweighed the fear. John, in his unshakable faith, believed that God would protect them, while Mary, pragmatic, saw the forest as a source of resources necessary for survival. The first few days were dedicated to establishing a routine. John and Thomas worked the land, trying to make it arable, while Mary and Elizabeth took care of the household chores and Samuel, the youngest. Despite the challenges, the family came together, finding solace in each other's company and hoping for a better future. But the forest, always present, seemed to watch. Small signs that something wasn't right began to emerge. Thomas, while exploring the forest, found strange symbols engraved on the trees, symbols that he could not understand but that instinctively made him feel afraid. At night, inexplicable sounds echoed from the depths of the forest. Whispers, muffled laughter and footsteps that didn't belong to any family member. The animals, normally skittish but not hostile, began to act strangely, as if they were being guided by an invisible force. Mary, increasingly worried, tried to maintain a calm facade, but her sleep was plagued by nightmares of shadowy figures and evil presences. The tension in the cabin increased as the days passed and the signs that they were not alone became undeniable. Patriarch John, although a man of faith, could not ignore the signs much longer. He knew that to protect his family, he would have to understand the nature of the forces that seemed to lurk in the darkness of the forest. Their decision to isolate themselves to escape the community's judgment now seemed to have placed them in even greater danger. The forest surrounding the family's new abode was a vast sea of ancient, towering trees, their intertwined canopies blocking out the sunlight and creating a perpetually gloomy, damp environment. The trees, some of which looked hundreds of years old, had thick trunks and exposed roots, snaking across the ground as if trying to reclaim the space around them. Among the trees, dense bushes and low plants created a natural maze, making navigation difficult and disorienting. From the first days, the presence of the forest was felt in an unsettling way. At first, they were small details that could easily be ignored or rationalized. The wind that passed through the trees seemed to whisper unintelligible words, an almost human sound but always out of reach. Small stones or branches moved without explanation, as if they were moved by invisible hands. And there was that persistent feeling of being watched, an invisible pressure that made itself felt in every silent moment. Children, more susceptible to environmental influences, were the first to realize that something was wrong. Thomas, the oldest, spoke of shadows that moved between the trees, indistinct figures that disappeared whenever he tried to get closer. Elizabeth, normally brave, began having recurring nightmares, waking up in the middle of the night with choked screams and a cold sweat. Even little Samuel, still unable to clearly articulate his fears, showed signs of discomfort, often pointing toward the forest with a look of terror. Matriarch Mary, who had always been the pillar of the family, began to feel a more direct and disturbing presence. As she washed clothes in the nearby stream, she saw reflections in the murky waters that didn't match the reality around her. On one occasion, while she was alone at home, she felt an icy touch on her shoulder, but when she turned around, there was no one there. These incidents, although isolated, began to add up, creating a climate of growing anxiety and distrust. John, with his unshakable faith, tried to rationalize the events. He attributed the sounds to forest animals and the strange movements to wind and nature. But over time, even he began to doubt his own explanations. One night, while he was in prayer, he clearly heard his name being whispered in a tone that was not that of any family member. The voice was soft, almost seductive, but it carried a veiled threat that he couldn't ignore. Determined to protect his family, John began to explore the forest more deeply, trying to understand the origin of these phenomena. It was on one of these expeditions that he found the first clear signs of something truly sinister. Strange and intricate symbols were carved into the trees, many of which appeared to have pagan origins, predating the arrival of the Puritans. He also discovered remains of ancient buildings, now almost completely reclaimed by nature, but clearly built by human hands. The symbols, with their hidden meanings and disturbing shapes, seemed to watch John as he walked. In a clearing, he found a circle of stones arranged in a ritualistic manner, in the center of which were animal bones arranged in patterns that suggested ancient sacrifices. These findings confirmed John's worst fears. The forest was not just a place of wild beauty, but a territory claimed by ancient and malevolent forces. The patriarch returned to the hut, full of concern. He knew that his family's mere presence there could have awakened something ancient and evil, and that the battle for survival would become increasingly spiritual and mental as well as physical. The decision to settle on the edge of that forest, which had initially seemed like an act of faith and resistance, now turned out to be a monumental challenge against forces he barely understood. The sinister forces beginning to surround the family were palpable and were just beginning to show their true power. The forest, with its darkness and ancient secrets, became an increasingly oppressive and threatening presence, testing the faith, courage and sanity of each family member. As time passed, supernatural events in the family's lives began to intensify, making it clear that something terrible was manifesting in the forest and in their daily lives. The climate of fear and paranoia grew every day, and the family began to realize that they could no longer ignore the signs. The nights were the most terrifying, when the darkness seemed to bring with it an evil presence that haunted the cabin and invaded your dreams. It all started with little things. Mary, while cooking, began to find everyday objects in places she was sure she hadn't left them. Pans, spoons and even food changed places in an inexplicable way. Elizabeth and Samuel often woke up in the middle of the night, crying and saying they saw eyes watching them through the window, even when it was closed and covered. Thomas, the eldest son, began to be haunted by visions of shadowy figures during his walks in the forest, figures that disappeared as soon as he tried to approach them or even call for help. John, who had always been a man of faith and reason, began to see his own sanity crumble. During his prayers, he felt a presence that seemed to mock his words, an icy sensation that seeped into his bones and made his skin crawl. One particularly disturbing night, as he prayed fervently for protection, he heard a low, guttural laughter coming from inside the cabin, as if he were being watched by something amused by his despair. The strange events were not limited to the interior of the cabin. From the outside, nature seemed to be in conspiracy against the family. Harvests, initially promising, began to wither and die without explanation. The animals, which previously kept a respectful distance, became aggressive and violent. Sheep and goats disappeared without a trace, and the few remaining animals displayed strange and frantic behaviors, as if they were constantly panicking. One of the most disturbing episodes occurred when Mary and Elizabeth went to the stream to get water. As they filled the buckets, Mary saw the reflection of an unknown woman in the water, a pale, ghostly figure with empty eyes and a pained expression. Startled, she looked around, but there was no one there except her and Elizabeth. The reflection remained for a few seconds, only to suddenly disappear, leaving Mary shaking with fear and confusion. Desperate for answers and with their faith wavering, the family decided to conduct a complete inventory of their property, looking for any clues that could explain the supernatural events. During this search, John found an old diary hidden in the cabin's attic, a book with yellowed pages and a worn leather cover. The diary, written by a former resident of the region, detailed experiences similar to those the family was living. The report spoke of an evil presence that inhabited the forest, an ancient and vengeful entity that fed on the fear and despair of intruders. The diary mentioned rituals and symbols that could be used to appease or even banish the entity, but it also warned about the dangers of trying to confront it directly. The diary's author, in his last entries, seemed to be on the verge of madness, with his notes becoming increasingly incoherent and desperate. He mentioned voices that called to him at night, shadows that moved of their own accord, and a constant feeling of being watched. With this new information, the family faced a terrible dilemma. Ignoring the diary's warnings and continuing to try to survive in the forest meant submitting to an existence of continued terror. Trying the rituals could appease the entity, but it also ran the risk of provoking its wrath even further. The decision of which path to take weighed heavily on John and Mary, who now fully understood how serious the threat they faced was. With each passing day, the situation became more untenable. The forest, which had initially seemed just a natural challenge, now revealed itself as a spiritual battlefield, where forces beyond human understanding moved against the family. The fear and paranoia growing inside the cabin threatened to destroy them as much as the forces outside. It was clear that a resolution was needed, and quickly, before the family's sanity and hope were completely consumed by the shadows that surrounded them. The family, now aware that they were in a battle against supernatural forces, decided to explore deeper into the forest secrets, hoping to find a solution to the growing threat. Armed with the information from the old diary, John and Thomas ventured further than they had ever gone before, while Mary, Elizabeth and Samuel stayed in the cabin, trying to maintain a routine of normalcy despite the fear that enveloped them. During their explorations, John and Thomas discovered a number of ancient and mysterious landmarks scattered throughout the forest. These markers, constructed of roughly hewn stones, were covered with the same symbols that John had previously found carved into the trees. These symbols, now understood as part of pagan rituals, suggested that the forest had been a place of worship long before the arrival of the Puritans. In a hidden clearing, they discovered what appeared to be the center of these rituals. In the middle of the clearing, there was a stone altar, covered in moss and vegetation, with carvings that told a story of sacrifices and invocations. Around the altar were the remains of black candles and bone fragments that, by this point, were almost completely buried in the earth. The place emanated a feeling of unease and despair, as if the land itself was contaminated by the darkness that had been invoked there. As they explored, John found an ancient scroll hidden within a fissure at the base of the altar. The parchment, written in an ancient and unknown language, appeared to contain instructions for rituals designed to appease the entity haunting the forest. Although they could not read most of the text, the drawings and diagrams were clear enough to provide some clues about the necessary rituals. Upon returning to the cabin, John and Thomas shared their discoveries with Mary and the children. The family, united by desperation and the need to find a solution, began to decipher the parchment symbols and diagrams with the help of the ancient diary. Between the diary entries and the symbols on the parchment, they realized that the entity that haunted the forest could be appeased through a complex ritual of purification and symbolic sacrifice. The ritual required several specific elements, all of which were difficult to obtain and dangerous to manipulate. First, they needed to gather specific herbs and plants found deep in the forest, many of which were known for their mystical and healing properties. Furthermore, they needed an ancient artifact, mentioned in the diary, which should be buried somewhere near the stone altar. This artifact, described as a protective amulet, would be essential to complete the ritual and protect the family from the entity's reprisals. With renewed courage, John and Thomas returned to the forest, this time accompanied by Mary, who insisted on helping to search for the necessary herbs and plants. Elizabeth and Samuel, although young, were in charge of keeping the cabin safe and preparing a space for the ritual. The tension was palpable, but the family was determined to face the danger head-on, united by a common goal. During their search, the family faced numerous dangers and obstacles. The forest, which seemed alive and aware of their intentions, constantly tried to divert and disorient them. Strange sounds and disturbing sights accompanied each step, testing their courage and determination. Despite this, they managed to gather all the necessary plants and finally located the amulet buried nearby the stone altar, as described in the diary. With all the elements in hand, the family returned to the hut to prepare for the ritual. Night was approaching, and time was short. They knew that the entity became stronger and more active at night, and any mistake could have disastrous consequences. They set up a circle of protection inside the hut, using salt and mystical herbs, as indicated in the parchment and diary. As Mary and Elizabeth prepared the ingredients for the ritual, John began tracing the protective symbols on the ground around the circle. Thomas, in charge of the amulet, positioned it in the center of the circle, where it would serve as the focal point for the ritual. The candle flames flickered as the family began to chant the words of the ritual, a mixture of Latin and the ancient unknown language of the parchment. As the ritual progressed, the temperature in the hut began to drop drastically, and a palpable presence of darkness began to envelop the family. Shadows danced on the walls, and whispers that were once only heard in the forest now filled the space around them. The entity, sensing the attempt at purification, seemed to resist with all its strength, making every word and movement of the ritual a monumental effort. Finally, at the climax of the ritual, John raised the amulet and spoke the final words, ordering the entity to leave the forest and never return. A sepulchral silence took over the cabin, followed by a deafening roar that seemed to come from all sides. The candle flames were extinguished by a gust of freezing wind, and the entire cabin shook as if it was about to collapse. The deafening roar that filled the cabin ceased as suddenly as it began, plunging everything into a deep, oppressive silence. The family, still gathered in the protective circle, looked around, trying to process what had just happened. The air was thick, charged with the feeling that something monumental had changed. Slowly, they realized that the oppressive presence that had enveloped the hut seemed to have dissipated. The shadows on the walls were quiet, and the whispers that had tormented them so much were now silenced. John, still holding the amulet, felt a wave of relief, but also exhaustion. The ritual had drained his energy, but it seemed to have been successful. He looked at Mary and her children, seeing the same tiredness in their eyes, but also a glimmer of hope. Despite the fear and tension, they had managed to face the entity and perform the purification ritual. For a few days, the family remained vigilant, watching closely for any signs that the entity might still be present. But the forest, which once seemed alive with a malevolent presence, now seemed just a natural, silent expanse. The disturbing sounds had stopped, and the animals returned to behaving normally. The crops, surprisingly, began to show signs of recovery, and the feeling of constant fear that had dominated their lives seemed to be fading. However, the family was not willing to let their guard down completely. They knew that the entity could have been temporarily appeased, but not destroyed. They decided to strengthen their faith and spiritual practices, maintaining a routine of prayers and protective rituals. John made a point of teaching Thomas the symbols and rituals he learned, ensuring that the next generation would also know how to protect themselves against supernatural forces. As peace began to return, the family used the time to reflect on the events they had faced. They understood that the forest was a place of ancient power, with secrets that dated back to times before the Puritans. They respected these secrets, avoiding the darkest areas and staying away from the ancient landmarks and the stone altar. John and Mary decided it was important to educate Elizabeth and Samuel about the dangers they faced and the importance of living in harmony with their surroundings. The Puritan community, upon hearing scattered reports of the family's struggle against supernatural forces, began to look upon them with a mixture of respect and awe. Some began to see John no longer as a heretic, but as someone who faced evil and survived. However, the family chose to remain isolated, preferring the tranquility of their new life to the turmoil and judgment of the village. As the years passed, the cabin at the edge of the forest became a place of local legend. Stories about the family who faced a malevolent entity were told around campfires, mixing fact and fiction. John, Mary, and their children lived with the knowledge that they had faced something beyond human understanding and survived, but always with silent vigilance, aware that the darkness might one day try to return. The experience left a deep mark on each member of the family, but it also brought them together in ways they had never imagined. They learned to trust each other unshakably, knowing that together they could face any adversity. The forest, now just a calm presence in their lives, served as a constant reminder that the world is full of mysteries and forces beyond human understanding. And so, the family continued their lives, a little wiser, a little more cautious, but always united and prepared for whatever the future might hold for them. They knew they had survived a test of faith and courage, and this experience changed them forever, making them guardians not only of their own safety, but also of the ancient secrets that the forest hid. The traumatic events the family faced left deep scars on each of them, but also brought significant changes to their lives and the way they saw the world. Mary, in particular, felt an internal transformation that led her to more deeply explore her spirituality and connection to the unknown. She began to study the old diary more diligently, trying to understand the rituals and symbols in hopes of unlocking more secrets about the forces that almost destroyed her family. Elizabeth, despite her youth, showed a growing interest in the mysteries surrounding the forest. She began to accompany her mother in reading the diary and studying ancient symbols, developing an impressive knowledge of the practices and rituals described. Elizabeth also began collecting herbs and plants that she found in the forest, creating a small herbarium that she used to prepare protective medicines and potions. Her interest in nature and the unseen forces around her made her a respected and feared figure in the community. Thomas, on the other hand, felt a different calling. The events he experienced alongside his father shaped him differently, instilling in him a determination to protect his family at any cost. He began to train more rigorously, improving his hunting and survival skills in the forest. Thomas also became a student of protective symbols and rituals, following in his father's footsteps but with a more practical approach focused on physical defense. His dedication to protecting his family turned him into a vigilant guardian. John, despite maintaining his faith unshakable, also felt the need to expand his spiritual understanding. He began to visit the village occasionally, sharing his experience with other Puritans and seeking advice from the elders. Although many still looked at him with suspicion, some began to see John as a man of great wisdom and courage. He was invited to participate in discussions about community safety and how to deal with possible supernatural threats. The family's relationship with the forest, although still marked by respect and caution, has also evolved. They learned to recognize the signs of nature and use this knowledge to their advantage. The cabin, once a symbol of isolation and fear, became a safe haven, a place where the family could live in relative peace while remaining aware of the world around them. The forest, with its secrets and dangers, became part of their lives in an intimate and inescapable way. Despite the calm that followed, the family knew that peace was fragile and that the forces they faced could return. Mary and Elizabeth continued to study the diary and other ancient texts they could find, expanding their knowledge of protective practices and rituals. They also began teaching Samuel, preparing him to understand and deal with supernatural forces, ensuring that he grew up with the same preparation that Thomas received. Meanwhile, Thomas and John continued to patrol the forest, not only to ensure the family's safety, but also to look for signs of any new threats. They noticed that the forest, although still dense and mysterious, seemed less oppressive as time passed. The protective symbols and rituals they had learned and implemented seemed to be working, creating an invisible barrier against evil forces. The family's legacy as guardians of the forest and the secrets it contained began to spread throughout the community. Other Puritans, who had previously avoided them, now came for advice and help. John, Mary, and their children began to play a more active role in the community, using their knowledge and experience to help protect not only their own family, but their neighbors as well. They organized meetings and shared what they learned, teaching others to recognize and confront supernatural forces. This new responsibility brought a sense of purpose and unity to the family, strengthening their bonds and determination. They knew that the battle against the forces of darkness was ongoing, but they were more prepared than ever to face it. Together, they formed a united front against any threat that might arise, confident in their knowledge and the strength they found in each other. The ancient diary, which had been a crucial guide in his struggles, was now treated as a priceless treasure. Mary and Elizabeth continued to add their own notes, creating an ongoing record of the family's experiences and knowledge. This book would become a legacy for future generations, a testament to their struggle and resilience. And so, the Puritan family, who were once shunned and faced unimaginable horrors, emerged as a beacon of strength and wisdom in a community that had learned to respect them. Although the secrets of the forest remained, the family was now equipped to deal with the unknown, and their story served as a powerful reminder that with courage, faith, and unity, even the greatest terrors can be faced and overcome. And so we come to the end of this extraordinary journey of the Puritan family who faced supernatural forces in 17th century New England. Their experiences show us not only the challenges they faced, but also the courage and wisdom they found within themselves to overcome these obstacles. This family story teaches us the importance of being prepared for the unknown, of maintaining faith and unity in the face of adversity. They remind us that the world is full of mysteries and that sometimes we must face what we don't understand to protect those we love. As we reflect on your experiences, I invite you to consider how these principles might apply to your own life. Perhaps you also face challenges that seem insurmountable or are curious about the hidden secrets around you. Learning from the Puritan family story can inspire you to be more vigilant, more courageous, and more prepared to face whatever the future holds. If you like this video and want more fascinating stories of courage and mystery, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. Share this video with friends and family who also appreciate engaging storytelling and in-depth learning. Together, we can explore more deeply the secrets of the past and the lessons they have to teach us. Thank you for watching and for joining us on this journey of discovery and reflection. Until the next adventure.